All right, hi everyone, and welcome back to Product Training with Blue Triangle. So last week we went over how to use the Blue Triangle API, and in that session we focused on the performance endpoint. So today we're going to touch on some of what we covered last week to get everyone up to speed, and then we'll be digging into the resource endpoint today. If you're totally new to the Blue Triangle API, that's not going to be a problem because we'll also be touching on some of the basics again as well. Before we get started, a couple of things I'd like to mention. The first is you will receive an email right after we're done here with a link to watch the recording. And if you'd like to share with someone, we will also be posting the recording in our Help Center at help.bluetriangle.com a little later today. Also, we invite you to ask questions during the session today, and you can do that using the window to the right of your screen. You can use either the chat tab, which is public, or the questions tab, which is private between you and the Blue Triangle team. And we're going to save time toward the end to go through those with you. All right. So my name is Mark, and I'm the support manager here at Blue Triangle, and I do these training sessions each week about all different kinds of topics related to web performance and analytics, and really solving problems using the Blue Triangle solution. Joining me today is one of our data analysts, Emily Krieger. And Emily is probably our biggest power user of the API, and certainly one of the most knowledgeable about it from the Blue Triangle team. So we're happy to have her expertise with us today. Emily actually joined us last week for questions, which was great. And just like last time, Emily today will be on standby to help answer questions as they come up in the chat, and we'll also be going over some verbally at the end. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So for the agenda today, we're going to model it much like last week's training. We're going to start with an introduction. For those of you who didn't join us last week, we'll be going over everything the Blue Triangle API can do. We'll talk about each of its current endpoints before we get into our focus on the resource endpoint. And then we'll touch on some of the basics like how to connect to the API, what are some of the headers that you're going to need to set. One of them is your API key, and we'll be showing you how to find that in your Blue Triangle profile. And then after we touch on some of those introductory topics, we'll be moving into our focus today, which is the resource endpoint. And we're going to start with a minimal request, which in other words is what are the required parameters needed to send a valid request to the performance endpoint, right? And then we'll expand on that into an example that does some filtering of the data. That would, for example, be filtering for desktop devices only, or filtering on a particular traffic segment. And then finally, we'll get into more of a complex example, which kind of pulls everything we've learned so far in the training together, sort of a sense for the power of what the API can do and help you with in terms of your analytics. And then finally, we'll go through and answer questions. And like I mentioned, Emily will be typing in some answers for you during the session today, but we'll save some toward the end to walk through with you verbally. All right, so just at a high level, these are the 5 endpoints that the Blue Triangle API currently has. So there's performance, resource, error, site event markers, and content security policy. So the 3 at the top are actually a little different than the 2 at the bottom. The 3 at the top are really for data access. So let me just go through those 3 real quick. The performance endpoint is for page level data. This is things like onload and time to interactive, and it also includes business metrics like revenue and orders. It includes page views and that sort of thing. Then the resource endpoint is different in that this data is web content detail, or WCD, otherwise known as resource data. These are basically the network requests. So this endpoint gives you performance detail for individual files and domains. And we're going to be digging into this after we touch on some of these basics quickly. All right, and then the error endpoint is for getting data on JavaScript errors. So this would include things like the error time and the error message. You can also use this endpoint to trend different types of errors over time. And it also includes things like content security policy violations. So that is what you can get from the error endpoint. So now these are all data access endpoints, like I mentioned. And then the two below are more for configuration. So site event markers, if you're not familiar with those, these are lined annotations that display on the graphs for your site or account. In other words, these mark significant events on the graphs over time in blue triangle. So this could be major browser updates, or outages, or any of those sorts of things. And what's great about the API is you can view, configure, update these event markers, essentially manage these things. So kind of a quick use case would be you can set up a trigger on your site when there's any sort of an issue. You can automatically create one of these event markers. So it's basically a hands-off automated system. And then when you go into Blue Triangle for analytics, you'll see these markers as perpendicular lines on your graphs. All right, and then the content security policy endpoint is pretty straightforward. It allows you to retrieve the content security policies you've built in Blue Triangle, and you can pull them by version or by name, or you can pull them all at once. So that's kind of an overview of everything the Blue Triangle API can do. So how do you get to the documentation? And it's in our Help Center, and you'll see there's a huge section for documentation, and there's actually a subsection for API documentation. And to get to the Help Center, if you're in Blue Triangle, in the top right, there is a question mark icon. Then if you click that and then Help Center, you'll be taken to our Help Center. And like I mentioned, you just click this documentation button, and you'll see a section in there for the API documentation. And each individual article in there will represent each of our API endpoints. All right, so now we're going to talk about how to connect to the API. So you can connect to the API in a variety of ways. And for this training, we'll be showing you examples using Postman, which is a really great tool for API testing. So when you're trying to connect to the API, there are 3 headers you're going to need to set. XAPI email. This is the email address in your Blue Triangle login. XAPI key, which we'll be showing you how to get that in just a second. And then the content type. Of course, this example is for the performance endpoint, but the resource endpoint is the same, in which we'll be doing a post of JSON data, and that will be api.bluetriangletech.com/resource. Some of our endpoints you can use a GET, for example, the content security policy endpoint, but the post is going to be what you use for the performance, resource, and error endpoints, which are the data access endpoints. All right, and then just wanted to point out one more time, the email addresses and the API keys are case sensitive. So if you get any errors with your initial requests, be sure to double check the case for your email and your API key, and also make sure these headers look just like this. All right, so how do you find your API key? it's actually pretty easy. If you click on your profile, this is the little person icon in the very top right of blue triangle. You can click to view your profile, and then in the details here in your profile, there's an API key that's already generated for you. There's no extra steps. This will be already available for you to use. All right, so putting everything together, this is what an example request is going to look like. I took this request from the slides last week, so it shows performance endpoint here. But this is the basic idea. So you'll be doing a post to api.bluetriangletech.com/resource. You'll have your headers set as we just went through in this tab, and the body. To set JSON, you're actually going to go into the body and select this raw option, and then over here in this drop-down, you'll choose JSON. And when you hit send with a valid JSON, you'll get a response back looking something like this. As we move into the rest of the training, we're going to be focusing on how to assemble this JSON to get the data that we want. All right. So the resource endpoint. When you hit the resource endpoint, you're going to be doing a post to api.bluetriangletech.com/resource, and that's what we mean by endpoint there. All right, so first we're going to start with a minimal example, and we're going to talk about the required parameters. If you look, you can actually look at there's a section for this in our documentation for the resource endpoint, and this link here will actually shoot you down right to this table. And as a matter of fact, we'll drop a link into the chat to download this set of slides so you can follow along and use this on your own time as well. But if you click this link, you'll go to our documentation required parameters section. And what you're going to quickly find if you joined us last week or you've used the API before for the performance endpoint, you'll see that each of these required parameters are actually the same as the performance endpoint. And this is for the resource endpoint. But just a quick note about that. So even though the parameter names are the same, you'll find that the values for the data columns and the group parameters are going to be a bit different. So again, the resource endpoint is data for network requests. This is performance information for domains and files, not the entire page, right? So some of the common data column options, and if you're not familiar with what these terms are just yet, we'll be going through each of these required parameters in just a second. But some of the common data column options would be things like element count, file duration, start time, file size, etc. And then for some of the common group by options, we'll have things like domain, file, host, and then page name and traffic segment would just be some normal ones, but the ones that we could certainly group by as well. So let's go through each of these required parameters. So the first one is the site parameter. So this is if you have a real user JavaScript tag on your site, this is going to be the prefix to the btttag.com/btt.js. If you don't have a JavaScript tag, you'll be able to find, we call it the prefix because it's the host name to btttag.com/btt.js, and you can find that prefix under the sites page in Blue Triangle. All right, and if you have any more questions about finding that for your own site, or if you have different sites, how to find the right site name for each of your sites, just let us know. And again, if you have multiple sites, this will be different for each of your sites. All right, so the next thing we'll go through is the data type. So this one is pretty straightforward. It is going to be RUM or synthetic. And if you're looking in blue triangle, this would be like, okay, do I want to look at data in the real user monitoring section or the synthetic monitoring section? And what we're doing over here is we're building this JSON as we go. So we have our site, demo sports, and our data type RUM. So let's move on to the next one, which are the start and end parameters. So these are going to be both epoch seconds. And a little visual depiction would be the time period selector in the filter options in blue triangle. And then another good tool to use for epochs is epochconverter.com. It's super, super helpful. You can convert just about any format of time to any other format of time, and it's really great for epochs as well. So another quick note, I know that this epoch start and end, they don't need to be in quotes. They can be integers, as you might suspect, but it will work in quotes as well. All right, moving on to the data columns. So when we're giving trainings on this, I think one of the best ways to explain data columns is this is the select clause in an SQL query. So some of the common ones would be element count, duration, start time, file size, etc. If the option or piece of data you're looking for isn't in the filters menu, it's actually in a graph or table in blue triangle, then there's a good chance it's going to be probably one of the data column options. And again, this kind of data is going to be found in places like the real user or synthetic aggregate waterfall page. You'll also find it if you're drilling into the real user performance detail. If you've found a page view or a synthetic test that you're digging into, when you dig into that and you're looking at the individual objects, and we call it the object level detail, there's a table view of that, and you can actually click a button to trend that resource over time, and that kind of thing would also be coming from the resource endpoint. All right, so the last one is going to be the group by parameter, and in speaking in SQL terms, this would be the group by clause of the query. All right, and then so kind of thinking in different terms, if this field is in the filter options, the field you would like to use here, chances are it's going to be a group by instead of a data column option. So some of the common ones again would be domain, file, host, and then some of the more generic ones that can be used both for the resource or the performance or the error endpoints, which are all data access endpoints. Things like page name, traffic segment, page group, AB segment, things like that. All right, so this is all the required parameters that we need. So we can actually go ahead and shoot this off to the API, and we'll show you this right here is actually a valid request to the API, and this is the response. So I'll kind of just talk through this. Again, we have our site set for demo sports. This is just our demo site that we use for, obviously demos and testing and things like that. We're looking at real user data, or RUM, and this is the start and end epochs for the time period we're looking at. And then now the question is, what data do we want? So what we're going to look at is the element count for each domain, right? In other words, element count is the number of times a particular file or element appeared on the site. And we're grouping this by domain. You could also group it by file, which would show obviously a little more spread out detail here, but grouping by domain, we get all of the files and all of the instances of those files bundled into one number for element count under each domain. So now we can move into a example using some additional filter options. And in this example, we're going to talk about how to reproduce the aggregate waterfall table. So this is actually a fairly common question we get in support. It's basically the user wants to pull data from our API into their own custom dashboard or their own custom report. And the question is, how do we reproduce a graph or a table that's in Blue Triangle? So for this example, we're going to add a few filter options. So let's say we want to filter on the PDP page for mobile and desktop devices, and we're going to limit our results to the top 700 files on the page. And this is what you'll see. This picture here is what you'll see in the aggregate waterfall page. And basically what we have here are 5 columns that we'll be able to put into our basic request JSON, and we'll show you how to do that right now. So first, we're going to start with our 6 required parameters for this endpoint. All right, we'll have our site, our data type is RUM, we have set our start and end time period and epoch, and then for the data columns, we're going to choose the element count, start time, and duration. So I'll just go back a slide, and so this file count here is the element count, relative start time is the start time, and this is basically the time the file started loading on average relative to the beginning of the page load or navigation start. And then duration is obviously duration. All right, and then we're going to group by file and domain. So now we're going to apply the additional filter options. Okay, so like I mentioned before, we want to add page name, PDP page, the device. We'll use mobile and tablet, and we're going to limit the data set to the top 700 elements or resources. And a couple other things, we can also order and sort the data set to match the portal. All right, so what does that look like? If we look at this JSON down here, we've colored in the additional parameters in blue here. So if you check our documentation, you can find these filter options. There's an entire section for what filter options are available, and you'll find the name, the parameter name, and whether it's an array or an integer or a string, and what the options are. So for the page name, we know it is just the page name in camel case, and it's an array of the string of pages. So for this, we just want to look at the PDP page, and then likewise for the device parameter, the options are mobile, tablet, and desktop, and we just want to look at mobile and tablet. So we're going to just put those into an array there. And then in the aggregate waterfall page, there's actually a filter option it's called number of objects, which essentially limits the results of the top X number of objects or resources that appeared on the site. And when I say top, that's by element count. So we're going to limit the results to just the top 700 files or resources. There's a few words that you'll notice I'm using interchangeably, like object and resource and element. These are all synonymous to the resources on the page. So this gives us the data, and then some formatting of that result set we can do with the order and sort parameters. So we're going to order this by start time, and we're going to sort it ascending. So if we go to the next slide, we can actually compare the response from the API to what we see in the portal. And when we do that, we can see In the top section here, our total items, our total basically rows of data is 581, and we can see that agrees with what we see in the portal for this table. We can see the first item in the list here is this file prod 83022, and that's corresponding to this item, which you can see the element count and duration all line up here. There's another row here that you can spot check to confirm you're getting the right data. So it's always a good thing to do, especially when you're replicating tables in Blue Triangle, to compare it, actually compare it to what you're trying to reproduce from Blue Triangle. All right, and if you haven't familiarized yourself with what a typical response looks like from the API, you'll get a few pieces of metadata up here. You'll get requests allowed and requests made. Requests allowed is the total number of requests allotted per day for your site, and requests made is the number of requests you've made today. Obviously, the site status 1 just means it's good. Other statuses would be they would correspond to error codes, and you can find those in our documentation. Total items, obviously, is how many rows or elements are in this array of data. All right, so we're going to end with more of a complex example. And for the use case here, we're going to look at kind of a common scenario for resource data. We're going to say, recently our site deployed an A/B test where there were some JavaScript files that had been modified, and we want to look at the load time detail for those particular files for the particular A/B segments. And we want to look at this for all of the pages on the site. So this is a lot of data, and it really isn't a great way to look at this kind of a thing inside of the Blue Triangle portal. So this kind of a custom data request, it really kind of shines a light on how the API can be so useful. So let's get into what this JSON is going to look like. First, we're going to start with our minimum parameters. Okay, and the data columns we're going to want are duration and start time. And then to get the page names and the A/B segments broken out, we're going to group by those, and of course we're going to be grouping by domain and file as well. Now, what do we need to do to add additional filtering and formatting? So the first thing we're going to do is specify the files. And if you check our documentation, you can see there's a parameter just called file, and you can specify what file names you'd like to zone in on. And we've specified those files here as an array of strings. The next thing, we'll specify which A/B segments we would like to filter on. And likewise, we've created an array of those strings. And before I get into some of the additional parameters here, it's important to note we want to look at this data for each individual page. And you may think, where is the page parameter in this request? Well, just the simple fact that we're grouping by page name, what the API is going to do is it's going to give us back a data element or a row in the response for each page name that has data for this file and A/B segment. So that's an interesting and important thing to note. Now, the order, sort, minimum sample, and limit parameters, these are all ways we're going to do some post-processing and filtering on the data set as a whole. So we're going to order by file and sort descending. Our minimum sample is 20, so this means we want to make sure that there's at least 20 instances of these files appearing, and we only want to see the top 1,000 rows of data. So this is a functioning API request, and while we don't have the response to show you here, we just wanted to emphasize the workflow that we go through in order to build a request like this from the ground up. So we're going to start with our required parameters up here, and then we're going to think through the filtering we want to do. For this example, we zoned in on a few files, and then we can add ordering and limiting and sample size restrictions with the result of that. All right, so just a few closing thoughts quickly before we finish up. So today we covered the resource endpoint of the Blue Triangle API. And this is much like the performance endpoint in that they have the same required parameters, but how you use those required parameters are a little different between the two endpoints. When putting together a new request to the API, you should always start with a simple request with the minimum parameters and build it up from there. Another helpful tactic is to go ahead and validate the response each time you add a new parameter along the way. Also, the best way to ensure you're pulling the right data is you can go ahead and load a similar or the exact graph or table you're trying to replicate in Blue Triangle, and you can compare that with the output from the API. And if you're troubleshooting a request, or maybe you're looking for an option that we haven't covered today, certainly visit the documentation section in our Help Center for that particular endpoint, whether it's the resource endpoint, the performance endpoint, or any of the rest of them. And as always, if you're stuck on a problem, we're happy to help, so please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach us at support@bluetriangle.com, or certainly you can reach out to your customer success manager. All right, so it looks like we do have one question to go through, and I see that we've gone over our 30 minutes here, and I apologize for that. We'll be finishing up here in just a couple minutes, but we'll go ahead and get started with that question. So, and Emily, I'll go ahead and ask this to you so you can join in on the fun here. So the question we have is, how can you find what the options are for ordering and sorting the results?
Yeah, absolutely. So for ordering and sorting results, you can definitely go under the documentation, and for the resource endpoint, you can click on the link for response formatting.
Yeah, I'm actually pulling this up now. Let me just
Awesome.
response formatting, right?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And so these are under optional parameters. You don't have to specify them. But for the resource endpoint, here are all of the columns you can order by, and then the sorting is going to specify if you want ascending or descending. If you do specify an order parameter, then it is going to expect a sort parameter as well, so that it knows which direction to sort by. But all those options are right in the documentation here.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah.
One more thing I'll just go ahead and mention quickly is it was a question that came up last week, and it was basically, it's great and all that we can use Postman, but how can I apply this to a program I'm trying to use, or some external programming language or something like that? So let me just show you a really cool feature of Postman quickly. So once you have your headers and you have the post to the right endpoint set, and you have your JSON in here, you can actually, there's this button over here to the right, code, and if you click that, you can actually convert this request to any of all of these different programming languages, including things like curl. There's JavaScript, there's PHP, Python, even Shell. So really cool feature there. So I think that can definitely help out. Okay. All right, with that, guys, we appreciate your time. And if you do have any further questions, we're happy to speak with you offline. So feel free to reach out to us anytime. You can reach us at any of the emails listed here. You can also reach us in support via the Help Center at help.bluetriangle.com. So next week, we won't have our usual Blue Triangle product training session because, drum roll please, our very own Gus Anderson and Tim Grant will be doing part 3 of our webinar series on content security policies. So we sent out an invite email to that webinar a little earlier in the week, and we'll be sending a reminder early next week as well. So be sure to look out for that and go ahead and register, because it should be a great discussion and really informative around some of the myths and mysteries or misunderstandings and misconceptions of what a content security policy can and cannot do. And for more information about our product training, like how to watch previous sessions or how to register for upcoming ones, be sure to check out our Help Center. Again, that is help.bluetriangle.com. And when you're there, you can click the big button for product training. All right, guys, thanks again for your time, and we hope to see you next time. Have a great day.